As leads with us for this first segment, we have Caroline Baxter, Director of the Converging Risks Lab and Senior Advisor at the Center for Climate and Security of the Council on Strategic Risks, who led the workshop on translating climate security language across research, policy, and military planning. Paul Rushton, Policy Officer at the Defense Policy and Planning Division of NATO for the Roundtable on Climate Security Tools and Cross-Sectoral Data. Catherine Wong, Team Leader of the Climate and Security Risk of the United Nations Development Programme for the Roundtable on Improving Early Warning Cooperation. And Tom Odell, Chief Analyst at the Defence Science and Technology Laboratory of the UK Ministry of Defence. Caroline, do you want to go ahead and share your takeaways?
I would love to. I promise, Scout's honor, I will make this both fast and interesting. So the point of this workshop was kind of twofold. The literal on-paper point of the workshop was to try to plan for Steadfast Defender 2030. The metacognitive point of the workshop was to get a cross-section of everyone in this room, military planners, policy practitioners, climate scientists, and researchers, to come into little groups, each of them being co-owners of the task of planning Steadfast Defender, and to then identify what questions they needed to ask and then have answered about the operating environment and the exercise itself in order to start weaving climate security into the planning for the exercise. Owing to the short timeline that we had for this workshop, we, as I said, just copy-pasted Steadfast Defender 2024 and spun the time of the wheel of time into the future. I think one takeaway from my perspective is that there's some limitations with that. I think there are a lot of people that really wanted to dig their teeth into a new scenario. So should there be more time for workshops next year and we do get to run this again, there will be a fresh, brand new scenario that and all the participants can fight, since that tends to be how these things go. But there are 5 main takeaways. The first one, which thrills me, was deep frustration. It was very frustrating, very complicated to figure out what questions you needed to ask. Phrase the questions in a way that you could get them answered, and then get the answer back in a way that you understood and then could use. And that was exactly the point of what we were trying to get after. The second one was that there are 2 levels of planning for an exercise. There is the planning the exercise itself, and then there's planning to actually do the exercise. And they have to be complementary, and climate has to affect both of them in equal parts. The third one is that, as is no surprise to anyone here, NATO is overloaded with objectives. And so adding climate is not an, oh boy, another one sort of situation. It is a, oh, how do I do this? And not just that, but because there are many different kind of ways to understand climate and climate change and climate security, defining your parameters right up front is very important. There is also the need for common data standards, which I think has been a through line throughout this entire conference. And nations identify their own climate realities differently. They each have their own climate imperatives. They have their own climate goals that need to harmonize and level up in order for that interoperability to be manifest through something like Steadfast Defender. Attendant to that, the fourth one was that resilience has a level of abstraction problem, whereby it kind of exists at a very high level, but it needs to come down to the tactical. And that is an art and a science in and of itself that needs to be understood if climate and climate security will actually weave into exercises like that. And then fifth and finally, trust matters. Trust between the community members of military policy, research, and science, but also trust organizationally. And we took a little bit of a cul-de-sac excursion into the idea of operational and organizational psychology, and also how do you structure an organization such that you don't have a bunch of converts to the climate security gospel who will then leave their positions in a couple years, and you're going to have to retrain the next cadre over and over and over. Rather, try to cement how you do this, the tools you use to do this, the data you use to do this, into the organization itself and into the roles as well as they are written, so that you have a longevity of organizational memory that will transcend the number of exercises that you are planning for. So I'm sure I missed a whole lot. I apologize to those in the room who attended if I did not carry some water for you, but you can yell at me at the next coffee break.
Thank you, Caroline. Even more level of trust building to factor into our organization and decision making. Paul?
Thank you, Pauline, and thank you, Caroline. You absolutely were both fast and interesting. I will be one of those things. I had the privilege of leading a discussion, moderating a discussion with 4 experts who brought in 4 diverse and fascinating and highly applicable climate security analysis tools. And in addition to learning about the specifics of each tools, it really gave us a profound sense of the diversity of analytical approaches that one can bring to truly understanding the climate change and security nexus, because they ranged in scale from the global to the highly local. They ranged in mechanism and causal approach from the climate via water to vulnerability nexus to the strains on militaries increasingly required to support natural disaster response and other civilian crisis action. And they had an enormous diversity of methodologies in the ways that they incorporated spatial data. That's the nerdy part of it. What for me was particularly fascinating, the key takeaways I took out of this. One is that climate science, climate analysis, climate conflict nexus has become a sufficiently diverse and complex field that tools like this are not merely one-offs, they're not intellectual curiosities, they are critical tools for importing and distilling the expertise that others are bringing to the situation. None of us has the ability to comprehend every causal mechanism or spatial scale at which the climate and vulnerability and security nexus is taking place. And these tools are the means by which we can comprehend a topic that is beyond any one of us to understand every aspect. Another piece that came out, because we had these tools that were diverse in their scale and their methodology, is that using multiple tools together, these multiple levels of analysis really proved to be not a luxury. It was essential for really being able to create a scientifically valid and informationally useful narrative. In particular, looking at correlation at a global scale and then using other tools to then explore causation at the local scale was something that really was critical for enabling a sophisticated multi-level analysis, and that allowed us to convey the complexity and severity of climate security issues, but without telling a too simplistic story with a certainty that we hadn't earned. And that's where it fed back into the broader themes of the conference for us, is that being able to provide this kind of analysis, being able to provide this kind of narrative was essential to effective and honest communication with decision makers, and foundationally in order to enable the decision making that is at the heart of military adaptation to climate change. So I have enormous gratitude to all of the presenters who shared their models and their insights, because I think we had a fascinating discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. And yeah, now I would already have so many questions. I won't be able to ask questions. That's my frustration. But I even wonder if these tools are even using, if there has been discussion about using a universal language, and that ties back to the translation part, because I feel like there are so many links between your 2 sessions, but that's for next year. Catherine?
Great. So fast and interesting. I think the bar's already been set quite high. I'll do my best to follow suit. But we really had an excellent session. The briefers offered some really important insights, I think, in terms of policy, in terms of technical innovation, and community engagement for effective early warning systems. And just 5 quick takeaways, and maybe 1 new acronym as well, if I may. On the innovation side of things, I think just personally, I was surprised to see the state of Earth observation and what we can do at the moment with geo observations, the applications that we have for civilian and military uses as well, being able to see the deforestation in the Amazon. I mean, of course, that's something we saw as well, but being able to see the roads being built out before the deforestation has taken place. In Sudan, being able to see populations that we have no access to at the moment, and data about what is actually happening in Ukraine at the moment. So I think this session was also one of paradoxes, I think you could say, because one thing that was clear to all of us was that we have more data at our disposal than we've ever had before, right? But we still don't have effective early warning systems. So second point, I think, second takeaway from this session would be just on access and equity and what it means. And again, despite having all this information, there is the challenge here of who has this information, what the responsibility is of those who are providing this information, and again, how we go about making sure that we provide access and understanding that there are communities that are there already, there are communities of practice, there are groups that we really want to engage in, and that participation is really going to be a key part of making sure that we're not only are we providing these early warnings, but they are being taken up at the same time and being used. The third point I think that came up that was really interesting was on interoperability, and the question that really got me thinking is, interoperability for what purposes? How much interoperability, how much harmonization do we need? And the challenge here of understanding those risks on the one hand, but then also understanding what to do to address them. So I think one of the key takeaways here is that maybe not all of the data, not every single piece of data, not collating and collecting everything is important. But we also have to think about, again, the quality of the data, and again, the means and the end. And then the fourth point, again, on trust and uptake, I think that also comes back to access and equity as well. And again, more data, not necessarily having more early warnings, and then better data, but not necessarily being taken up by the communities. I think it was an excellent example of the tsunami stones in Japan that have been there for hundreds of years, and that communities accepted this information readily, and they knew that you could not build any kind of buildings beyond these specific points, right? And again, how we communicate that information and this kind of cultural aspect of knowledge. So this was also an interesting session in terms of a discussion of psychology, of behavioral science. And then I also think a point that came up was just the burden of human condition, right? How we can have all of the information that we need at our disposal and still sometimes make the wrong decisions. The final point, I think, again, the fifth and final point, just on the security dimension of satellite technology and the challenges at the moment that some satellites might be turned off, what it would mean to be working in the dark and without this access. So I think this session really personally gave me a lot of food for thought in terms of what we're trying to do, how we're trying to achieve these objectives, even with, again, better data, better analytics, and better coordination in our favour. And then the acronym that I promised you, NIMTO, I hadn't heard that one before, so not in my term of office.
Thank you so much. I'm impressed by the scope of the discussions and how you went far beyond the technical aspect and touched on behavioral science. And it sounded fascinating. I did not attend it, and I'm sad. But yeah, we couldn't. Yeah, it's just nice that we're having this wrap up, so we can hear about it. Tom.
Thank you. And before I start, just probably thank actually our partners on this. We did these sessions with Archipelago of Design, who were just phenomenal to work with. So a huge thank you to them as well, not up on the stage. So over the last couple of days, we've done some deep dives in wargaming and the applications of that technique in the climate security context, which has just been great, building upon sort of sessions that Paul's been running, as well as the Foresight session earlier this morning. And really deep diving into the sorts of applications that it can be used for, the pros and cons, and the different ways of doing it. And thank you also for all those people that joined us. It's fair to say we probably had quite a lot of fun in what we were doing. I mean, who doesn't like playing games for work? And it's a really important point of actually what we do. maybe I'm very simple, but when I'm smiling and having a good time, I'm more engaged with things. And actually, we definitely found that was in the room. The energy was phenomenal. And actually, we can translate that across to our day jobs. If we can find a way to keep our senior officials, decision makers, generals, admirals, whoever it is, engaged with the topic, it's a really powerful, important point to make change in what we're doing. So definitely something that we shouldn't shy away from. I really encourage that. We looked at a couple of different reasons for why we do war games. And actually, these address two of the main barriers in my minds for why we're struggling in this climate security debate. The first one is people don't recognize it as a defense issue. Second one being they don't know what to do about it. Wargaming is just a perfect technique for looking at these sorts of things. You're immersing people into a scenario where they have got to try and achieve an objective in a confrontational manner. We can do this quite cleverly by designing it not to talk about climate change and actually reflecting afterwards about the issues they've been doing. We looked at something last few days looking at a water issue, which we didn't need to talk about climate change at all. It was just about a treaty that had broken down. Why it had broken down doesn't really matter until we start reflecting on it afterwards, and we can then talk about the science about how that's going to get worse. The really cool thing about it, though, is we are immersing those people playing the game into those sorts of environments. And it does enable us to reflect different people with different agencies, with different motivations and different objectives of what they were trying to achieve. One of the most fascinating takeaways that we had today was there was a couple of tables playing the game doing exactly the same ones. And we're reflecting afterwards. One of them said, we realized straight away that to achieve our objectives, we had to work collaboratively. Move on to the next table. We realized straight away that to achieve our objectives, we had to look after ourselves and promote self-interests. Completely contrasting, but it really does show the human behavior in this one and how difficult it is to navigate these sorts of issues. Now, wargaming is a really good tool for showing us, but it is one tool that we've got. Paul spoke around various analytical techniques, and I'd really encourage you all to look at wargaming as something that can be used, but amongst the other clubs in your golf bag. It is not the be-all and end-all, but it's certainly a good start. Thank you.
Thanks so much. We're wrapping up exactly on time. Thanks to all of you. So thank you for this. We'll have more discussion on war games, that's for sure, because I think that was also a session, both sessions that received a lot of engagement. I really want to thank the four of you for, again, preparing this on the spot with fried brain and still managing to be both succinct and interesting. So thank you also for everyone who attended these 4 sessions, for your engagement and for making it as interesting as it was, and as productive as it was. So lots of takeaways to think about, and I'll just let Jennifer take over with the next round of sessions. Thank you to all of you.
Thank you, Pauline. I would tell Paul to not run away too far because I'll ask the leads of the afternoon session to come back on stage. And thank you, Paul, for being one of the co-lead for 2 sessions today. So we had 3 sessions in the afternoon. 2 of them were co-led. So thank you for the contributions for all the leads of the sessions, and thank you for you on stage for sharing the key takeaways. We had 1 session on advancing civil-military cooperation in emergency management across the Alliance. That was led by Mr. Michael Hoskin, Community Resilience Research Portfolio Manager at Defense Research and Development Canada. 1 session on mainstreaming climate change in allied defense spending, commitments, and capability, led by Mr. Paul Rushton, Policy Officer, Defense Policy and Planning Division at NATO. And finally, a session on increased readiness and resilience through low-carbon warfare. Well, co-led, but with on stage to share the key takeaways, Dr. Duncan Depledge, Senior Lecturer at Loughborough University. I think to give a break to Paul, I'll start the other way around and ask Dr. Depledge to share the key takeaways of his session.
So much for my plan to sit at this end. No, thank you very much. I mean, first of all, thank you to my co-lead, Professor Bruno Charbonneau, for helping me to put this session together, and also all of the participants who I think embraced the opportunity to tackle some of the questions that we were posing. I think our session, probably with this idea of kind of low carbon warfare, was really trying to shift the attention and expand some of the sort of the core theme of this summit, being about climate adaptation in two ways, really. One is to acknowledge that there's a double adaptation that needs to go on here. The first being obviously adapting to the impacts of climate change, but the second one being that at the same time we have this unfolding energy transition at the global level, which is equally posing challenges that military and defense organizations are going to have to adapt to. The second way in which we were kind of pushing this main theme, though, I think was something I haven't actually heard too much about at the summit over the past 2 days, which is where are the limits to adaptation when it comes to the military. And I think this is quite an uncomfortable and provocative conversation to have, because it's actually thinking through, well, at what points do militaries potentially face certain system boundaries or tipping points, to use the language of planetary boundaries and tipping points, but what if we apply that in more of a socio-technical context to understand what militaries are doing? So we posed these questions to our groups, and we let them loose to explore these. And I think sort of just to summarize some of the key takeaways, the first one was very much that this is a very new thing to be thinking about, right? These sort of military system boundaries, and it was quite evident that it's quite a challenge to think through where those boundaries might lie, how far away we are from crossing them potentially, and also how you even start to quantify and identify which ones are the most important. So in that sense, I think this pointed to the fact that this is an interesting question that is very much worthy of further exploration. The second bit, though, that I felt came out of it was probably more cultural, and it's shifting away from just thinking about adaptation, whether to energy or to climate impacts, as a technical exercise, and thinking of it as a cultural exercise. We heard about how militaries are both very, very good at adapting, but also highly resistant to change. So how do you navigate that kind of tension? Secondly, there's this sort of sense of the military's can-do attitude and not necessarily wanting to think about limits on its ability to do things and where it might run into barriers which are going to require very, very different approaches to how they achieve effectiveness. And finally, what happens when the unnegotiable actually becomes negotiable? So really thinking through at what point are you reaching at what point do these impacts and challenges become so severe that things that you previously never contemplated are things that you absolutely have to deal with? Final point was just on how, as an alliance, NATO is obviously going to have a huge amount of diversity in terms of how it confronts these challenges, how it wants to respond to these. And in many respects, that could be seen as a challenge, but that diversity is perhaps also an opportunity to really explore how you leverage all of these different country perspectives to deal with some of these challenges. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing those perspectives of both the limitations and the opportunities, especially as you say, with NATO being such a big alliance, you have to create this cultural shift, not only in one country, but across all allies. Mr. Hoskin?
Thank you. So my session focused again on civil military cooperation during emergencies. Tom did a really good job leading us into this conversation. And so we relied quite heavily on the crowd. So I think we had a very good, diverse perspective and range of opinions on this. The conversation kind of went a little bit less about civil-military cooperation and more about the role of the military in emergencies. But there were some really good key takeaways, I think. So one was sort of the unique but limited role of the Canadian Armed Forces or the military in emergencies. And that's that the military can provide unique and sort of hard to replicate capabilities for disaster response. And so there's some sense that they will always be needed. It's not meant to replace civil authority or compete with the private sector. It's really meant to fill gaps when local or provincial capacity gets exceeded. And the aid the military provides should be carefully controlled to avoid eroding those civilian capabilities. There's also the theme of capacity strain in a climate-changed world. So civilian and local capacities are increasingly being stretched by frequency and scale of disasters, which is sort of causing this reliance on the military to some degree. But civil protection and volunteers can offload some of those, especially those low-skilled burdens, and free those specialists up to stay operational. For example, military folks can stay doing military work, and we can try and use maybe a youth corps or something like that to try and offload some of that sandbag filling, that kind of work. There was a lot of talk about Northern and Indigenous resilience. So Northern and Inuit communities live with constant infrastructure challenges. And so they've actually become quite self-reliant. I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from our Northern friends and neighbors when it comes to disaster response. And then the Arctic Rangers serve as the trusted stewards of the land up the north. And communities often seek Canadian Armed Forces help only as a last resort. So they will try to use Rangers first, rely on community resources, and then reach out to the CAP. So, you know, when the military says we're a force of last resort, maybe we could look north and get some good examples of how communities up there are a bit more resilient and actually use the military as a last resort. Another theme was leadership, foresight, and fragmentation. So there was a major issue of a fragmentation of responsibilities and sometimes unclear leadership during crises. And one thing that came up was oftentimes, you know, we'll see a problem coming long in advance, but nobody takes up, you know, nobody champions the cause to create a solution to the problem, even though there could be 100 solutions to this problem until it's sort of too late. There was also a bit of theme on cultural and structural barriers. So there is a general culture of underpreparedness, which persists, especially in Canada. Municipalities tend to be underfunded and overstretched. National standards for emergency management could drive some consistency and interoperability to fill that gap. And most failures trace to poor communication and not a lack of capability. Yeah, so I think I'll just wrap it up here. So, you know, effective civil-military cooperation really depends on foresight, communication, trust. That was another big point, was we tend to be losing a lot of that in-person collaboration at times, especially in this very digitized world. But it came up that fostering those in-person connections and lasting in-person connections, so, you know, transient people maybe are not the best people positioned to be liaison officers within communities, can really have a huge impact on fostering trust. And I think I'll leave it there. Thanks.
Thank you. It's not rare to see conversations around disaster response and civil military cooperation to kind of go into the direction of the role of the military in emergencies. And we see there's a lot of, we saw from the plenary panel earlier also, there's a lot of ideas, different perspectives. So the conversation will definitely continue on that topic. And finally, Paul?
Thank you very much, Jennifer, and thank you to the other panelists. Recognizing that I'm the last speaker and having already spoken, I'm going to try to make this either twice as fast or twice as interesting. The discussion that we had was about how we mainstream adaptation to climate change impacts into the development of capabilities and defense investment, which is a topic front of mind for many, given the substantial increases in defense investment that most allies have pledged to out of the Hague summit. And it's also extraordinarily apropos because NATO as a whole, and at least half of allies in their published climate defense strategies, have committed to mainstreaming climate change adaptation into the way they buy capabilities and the way they develop capabilities. But that is absolutely one of those things that is easier said than done, and there is no universal framework for how that ought to take place, because we operate in a world of incomplete information, not just about the course of climate change, but about how climate change will impact capabilities. We face trade-offs between current and future effectiveness that we don't always fully perceive. And we are fielding capabilities we might expect to use for 50 years in a world where we know the climate will be radically different 50 years from now. So the challenge that was put to our breakout groups, and they really brought it, was what's the foundation of a shared approach to how we mainstream adaptation into procurement? What are some principles and guidelines for how we can approach this in a way that respects the imperfect information but also recognizes the strategic necessity of doing so? You might figure rightly that this is a big topic for 90 minutes, and for my part, the key takeaway I bring from it is I want to come back and do this for 2 or 3 days and just really dive in. But honestly, despite the restrictions, our contributors, everyone participated, you have my enormous thanks because you have brought some really, really valuable insights. I will not attempt to capture all of them, but a few things that really leapt out at me and that I think can be the basis for future discussion. One is that when we're identifying what climate scenario we want to adapt to, it's very easy to say that we want to adapt to the worst case scenario, but that's also the most expensive scenario. So we need to be honest with ourselves about the trade-offs that we're making and the limit to which we are willing and able to adapt in our capabilities. And when we're being honest with ourselves, it's also really critical to ensure that we are communicating effectively between military and civilian decision makers about what those impacts really look like, or that we're being comprehensive, that we're explaining well to decision makers both what the cost of adaptation and the cost of inaction are going to be. And that's part of a critical need for a narrative about what adaptation can do to increase military effectiveness. Another participant very rightly cautioned us that capabilities isn't just equipment. Capabilities is everything. Capabilities is platforms, big and small, but it's also infrastructure, it's also installations, and it's also the human body. And there may be aspects of each capability that can be adapted and others that can't. It's possible that in certain environments we will approach the functional limit of the human soldier, in which case we will have to find other ways to adapt effectively, but we cannot get bound into thinking that we're only talking about major platforms. An insight that I particularly loved was to always remember that the enemy gets a vote, which is to say that we are not just adapting against climate change, but we are adapting to climate change in a world where our adversaries will be keen to exploit any gap in our capabilities and any failure to adapt, which is to say that if our capabilities are declining because of the effects of climate change, it's not a problem in and of itself. It's a problem because it presents a challenge to our deterrence and defense posture that can be further exploited. And in a contested Europe where we are no longer at peace, this is a foundational challenge to us. A few other pieces that really leapt out. One is we need to find ways to ensure that allies can individually exploit their comparative advantage, because allies may be better able to support adaptation in certain domains or of certain capabilities than others, and we need a way to understand who does what best and share that amongst ourselves. And we can explore things like modular technologies and approaches. If you can understand not just which capabilities are struggling in the face of climate change, but which parts of those capabilities are struggling. Maybe you don't need to replace the entire F-35. Maybe you need to replace the refueling gasket on the F-35 and buy yourself another 5 years of useful life. But what I really took away from this is that the depth of issues that we need to explore in this goes beyond what you can get in a 90-minute session, but the density of insight and guidance that came from our participants in the short time that we had was exemplary. So thank you.
Thank you. Like we said on the first day of the summit, it was definitely an ambitious agenda. 90 minutes was short for all of the sessions, but I think we achieved our objective